Good day. The reverberations of the decision by the United States to announce its agreement with Britain and Australia to set up this new association, AUKUS, to confront China, and of the US decision to supply Australia with nuclear technology to assist Australia to build a fleet of nuclear submarines continues to reverberate around the world. But today in this program, I'm going to discuss briefly, or touch on briefly, an event which took place just a week earlier, which concerns that telephone conversation between President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping of China. Because over the last couple of days, we've had a number of briefings which have appeared in the media about that call, and which in themselves are extremely suggestive about the overall state of US-China relations. Firstly, we have been informed by the usual sources that the decision to initiate that call with Xi Jinping came from the fact that the United States government and President Biden himself were becoming increasingly frustrated and alarmed that all the lower level contacts between the administration and US diplomats and their Chinese counterparts were getting nowhere. Now, I have done program after program discussing these various meetings, starting with that disastrous summit meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, where the Chinese simply steamrolled over Secretary of State Biden and his officials. There was a similar disastrous summit meeting between Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, and the Chinese in Tianjin, at which the Chinese handed over to Wendy Sherman documents listing China's red lines and lists of demands of what the United States needs to do in order to improve relations. And of course, we've had also some incredibly tense conversations between Wang Yi and other Chinese officials and members of the US administration, such as Antony Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, and John Kerry, the administration's climate czar. And it turns out that perhaps the conversation which upset and alarmed the US administration most was that conversation that John Kerry had with Yang Jiechi, the departmental head of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee, who deals with foreign policy issues and also climate change. And it turns out that the administration was stunned to find the Chinese completely unresponsive to the administration's agenda on climate change. All of this emphasizing and illustrating to the US administration that this attempt by the Biden-Harris administration to conduct an a la carte foreign policy with China, confronting China on some issues, but gaining Chinese cooperation on others, was going nowhere because the Chinese were not prepared to conduct foreign policy with the United States in that kind of way. So, repeating the trick that they pulled off in April when they found themselves in a crisis over Crimea with the Russians, Crimea and Ukraine with the Russians, and when it appeared briefly as if there might be a war in eastern Ukraine, which Ukraine would catastrophically lose, handing the Biden-Harris administration an extraordinary foreign policy disaster. The administration arranged for the president, Joe Biden himself, to telephone the Chinese leader, just as back in April, Biden had telephoned the Russian leader, and to propose a summit. Now, back in April, the Russians were extremely skeptical about the prospects of a summit meeting with Biden, but they decided to go along with it. I think partly because they calculated that if there was a summit meeting, American objections to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline might fall away, and there might be a brief stabilization of the situation in the summer. So a summit meeting between Putin and Biden did duly take place in June, though it must be said that it achieved no very great positive outcome and certainly no breakthrough, as I discussed briefly in a video, by the way, which received minimal circulation, something which I will discuss perhaps some other day and in some other place. Anyway, that has led the administration on this occasion to try to repeat the same trick with the Chinese, try to arrange a meeting with Xi Jinping between the President of the United States and the Chinese leader, try to talk things through in some form, try to come to some kind of stabilization of the relationship and try to put things on a calm and even track so that the administration could return to its policy, or at least claim to itself that it was achieving progress on its policy of pursuing an a la carte relationship with China, whereby the United States presses ahead with confrontation with China, but seeks China's cooperation on matters important to itself. And what happened, and it's now absolutely clear what happened, is that the Chinese, Xi Jinping, proved completely unresponsive. We learn from media accounts that his language was not quite as harsh as those of people like Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, but it was pretty tough and it was completely uncompromising. Xi Jinping not only refused to give an inch on any issue, but he simply ignored Biden's requests for a summit. And when Biden downgraded those requests to a virtual summit, in other words, to a Zoom or that kind of exchange, Xi Jinping proved unresponsive also. And it's quite clear that the US came away, the administration came away, profoundly shocked by the fact, and also, one senses, increasingly alarmed and uncertain about what to do. Because to be very clear on a host of issues, first and foremost, of course, the administration's very ambitious climate change agenda, but also concerns about the situation around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. The United States desperately needs to at least work with China to work out some form of lines of communication with the Chinese in order to manage this confrontation. And what the Americans are finding is that the Chinese are not interested. As far as the Chinese are concerned, it is all or nothing. Either the United States takes steps to try to improve matters with the United States, with China, or alternatively, the situation will just go on deteriorating in the same way as it has up to now. And it seems that yet again, the administration and the Americans were taken aback by the fact that Xi Jinping, just like all the other Chinese officials, blamed the United States, blamed the administration for the deterioration in the relationship, and made it extremely clear to the Americans that as far as he was concerned, as far as China is concerned, it is the United States that must take the first steps to improve relations, and unless it does, China is not interested in playing ball with them. Now, that is a kind of message, a kind of warnings that the United States is simply not accustomed to receiving. As I have discussed many times in many programs, the United States, always accustomed to being the most powerful country, has always in the past dictated to other countries or read out lectures to them. It is not accustomed to being dictated to, and it is not accustomed to have lectures read out to itself. That is something Americans find profoundly shocking and extremely difficult to cope with. There have been To my knowledge, just two exceptions to this rule. One was the Paris negotiations between Vietnam and the United States that took place at the fag end of the Vietnam War, when the United States was trying to find some means of disengaging from Vietnam to achieve what it called peace with honor. And we know that American officials who negotiated with the Vietnamese at that time were astonished and exasperated by the tough line the Vietnamese took throughout the negotiations and the extent to which the Vietnamese were completely unwilling to compromise on any of their core issues, notwithstanding what the United States tried to do to them in terms of bombing and such like to get the Vietnamese to change their minds. The other experience the United States had with a similar nature was its negotiations with the Soviets in the late 1960s and early 1970s to agree strategic arms limitations. And here again, the Soviets proved incredibly tough on key issues. And I remember reading at the time an American complaint that the Soviets were behaving like a defective slot machine in which the Americans were expected to put money without any guarantee of anything coming out the other end. So we have those two exceptions, both, by the way, long ago in the early 1970s, when the United States found itself faced with tough negotiations with other parties, which it didn't really have much way of getting round, but which I should say did eventually result in an agreement. But of course, in those days, the United States had not become accustomed to thinking of itself as the undisputed hegemon, the indispensable country that stands taller, sees further, has the right to rearrange everybody's internal affairs to suit itself. And for the United States to be exposed to lectures and hardline negotiation and tough ball negotiating tactics from China, after it assumed that overweening role for itself, that clearly has come as a profound shock. Now, I'm going to say something. I think the Chinese would have reacted in exactly the same tough, unyielding way, even if situation had been different, and it had not been the case that the United States, whilst talking to China, was also engaged with secret talks with Taiwan and was also engaged in secret talks with Australia. Now, I say that because I'm absolutely certain that the Chinese, over the last couple of weeks and months, have certainly been aware that there have been these secret talks between the United States, Taiwan, and Australia underway. I say that because the Chinese obviously have a very sophisticated intelligence operation, as, by the way, do the Russians, and I'm pretty sure that the Chinese and the Russians between them know a great deal about what is going on in the world, even if they don't always talk about it. In the case of Taiwan, I would personally be astonished if the Chinese do not have a very sophisticated intelligence operation in Taiwan, if China hasn't infiltrated pretty much every level of the Taiwanese government or authority with its own agents, and if it isn't fully aware of all the steps that the Taiwanese authorities are taking. So I am pretty sure that the Chinese were aware of these secret discussions that were taking place in the United States between the United States and the authorities in Taiwan to upgrade the status of Taiwan's mission to the United States to a Taiwan representative office. And that, of course, won't have pleased the Chinese at all. and will certainly have encouraged them to take the extreme hard line that they have taken in their discussions with the Americans. Now, it's possibly more complicated in the discussions between the United States, Britain, and Australia, but there again, I would be very surprised indeed if negotiations on this scale and complexity could take place without the Chinese getting at least some wind on them. Even if the Chinese perhaps don't have quite the same degree of intelligence penetration over Australia and, of course, the United States as they have over Taiwan, I'm pretty sure that they were aware that some level of talks were going on between the Americans and the Australians, and no doubt the British, and that something big was on the way. And that, of course, will also have inclined the Chinese to take a very hard line with the Americans. But putting all that to one side, I'm going to say straight away that I think the days when the United States could conduct a la carte negotiations, both with the Chinese and, by the way, also with the Russians, are now definitely over. The Russians have been quite open about this, and indeed we've had comments to this effect from President Putin himself. They're saying quite openly that they're not prepared to negotiate or deal with the United States on that sort of basis. The United States must acknowledge and recognize Russia's red lines involving Ukraine, NATO expansion, probably EU expansion, and all the rest, if it really does want Russia's cooperation on all sorts of issues. And, of course, the Chinese, in a much stronger position than the Russians, are in a position to take this much further. And I think that the Americans are finding this extremely difficult to acknowledge or to understand. They seem to think that countries like China and Russia will somehow feel grateful if the United States tells them that it is prepared to work with them on some issues of interest to itself and not to others. And we get a sense of the extraordinary inability of the Americans to understand that the Chinese and the Russians don't think in that way from some further commentary. Now, I was reading, I think it was in the Financial Times, a piece which said that the Americans were somewhat baffled by the fact that Xi Jinping refused to meet with Biden and was speculating as to what the reasons for that might be. They were wondering whether it might be connected to the pandemic and the restrictions on the pandemic, or whether it might be something else. But the fact that they're talking about pandemic restrictions is contradicted by the announcement that's just been made from China that the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, fully intends to attend the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Dushanbe in a few days. Moreover, it seems that not only is Xi Jinping intending to attend that meeting, but that he had intended also to meet with his primary ally, Vladimir Putin, at that meeting, but that obviously has had to be called off because Putin will not be able to attend the meeting since he is currently in self-isolation because of the fact that some members of Putin's administration have been affected by the pandemic. Nonetheless, Putin and Xi are going to have an intense virtual summit meeting, which is, of course, precisely what Xi Jinping refused to do when it was suggested to him by Joe Biden. Now, I think that all of this points to a fundamental reality. The first is that the United States, if it really does want to stabilise its relationship with China and indeed with Russia, needs to put aside the idea that it can negotiate with them on an a la carte basis all that does is incentivize the Russians and the Chinese to take the hardest line possible, and in both cases to ramp up their military procurement and their enlargement of their strategic forces. And we see that with the Russians pushing ahead with their hypersonic missile deployments and with their plans to develop anti-ballistic missiles, and also, of course, the new weapon systems that we've been hearing about, the Poseidon submarine drone and the Burestvenik nuclear-powered cruise missile system. And we learn that the infrastructure to field and deploy the Poseidon nuclear-powered submarine drone, that most destabilizing and dangerous of all new weapon systems, is now proceeding apace, with deployment now expected in just a few years. And of course, in the case of China, we see China building silos in various bases, with the United States left guessing about whether or not this is intended to deploy nuclear missiles or not, but with the Chinese making it crystal clear that they have no intention of negotiating with the United States on nuclear weapons limitations, and that as far as they're concerned, the attitude of the United States is encouraging them to increase their nuclear weapons developments. And I'm going to add further that this announcement about submarine technology being provided to Australia is, over the next few years, going to make the Chinese focus even further on their military developments in the Pacific. And I predict that as a result of this, we're going to see more Chinese missiles, more Chinese aircraft, and above all, more Chinese submarines, including nuclear-powered submarines, being deployed at a much faster rate than the Americans and the Australians can get Australian Navy nuclear-powered submarines into service. That's going to take at least 10 years, perhaps 15, by which time the Chinese are going to have a very powerful nuclear fleet indeed. But there is something else which I think the Americans perhaps need to start thinking about very carefully, because, of course, China and Russia are now strategic partners. They've discussed and with each other technology sharing, and of course they've already undertaken that to a limited extent. Well, perhaps not to such a limited extent. We know that the Russians have provided the Chinese with extensive know-how to enable China to develop its anti-ballistic missile early warning system, which the Chinese would have had more difficulty doing by themselves. But we also know that the Chinese and the Russians might have, inspected, apparently, each other's stealth fighter jets, and are apparently sharing technology in those fields also. It's highly likely that before very long, we're going to see S-500 anti-ballistic missile interceptors appearing on the Chinese mainland to counter US missile systems. But there is, of course, something else, which is, of course, that the Russians, who are the world leaders both in hypersonic missile technology and in intercontinental ballistic missile technology, might now start to share some of that technology with China. I say that because if the United States is willing to share nuclear technology with Australia, pushing the edge on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's highly likely that the Chinese will come along to their Russian friends and say to them, well, if the Americans are prepared to share that kind of technology with Australia, perhaps the time has come for you to share some of your missile and hypersonic technology with us. After all, the United States already shares missile technology, sea-launched ballistic missile technology with Britain, given that China and Russia are now partners at the same level, maybe the time has come for China and Russia to start doing the same thing. And given the extent to which China and Russia are drifting ever closer together, and given the extent to which the Russians themselves depend on Chinese support for diplomatic and political leverage over the Europeans, and indeed the Americans also, there has to be a very high probability that the Russians will agree. In which case, we're going to see a further cranking up of the arms race. After all, the Americans are going around saying, well, we're going to provide the Australians with the technology to build nuclear submarines, but we're not going to provide them with nuclear weapons. What is to prevent the Russians turning around and saying, well, in that case, we're going to provide China with advanced missile technology and perhaps even with Poseidon submarine technology. But of course, we're not going to provide them with the nuclear warheads which go along with those sort of weapon systems. After all, China is perfectly capable of developing its own nuclear warheads, as it has repeatedly shown. And perhaps the Russians will do something else. Perhaps they will also start to share increasingly their much more advanced submarine technology with the Chinese, in which case we could start to see Yasin-style nuclear-powered submarines appearing in the Pacific, probably long before any Australian submarines based on the Virginia-class technology start to appear in the Pacific. Well, all of this, to my mind, points to a strategic nightmare for the United States. So I think the United States needs to put aside this illusion that it can conduct diplomacy with the Eurasian powers a la carte. I'm not saying that all of these things are going to happen, and perhaps there might be all kinds of other developments. I know, for example, that there's a great deal of excitement on the part of some people in the United States at the moment about the fact that Evergrande, which is a large Chinese property company, has gone bankrupt, and this is again encouraging expectations that the Chinese economy is about to collapse, that it's really a house of cards, that China will face a major crisis, that its growth rates are going to slow. I have to say, I think all these hopes are illusory. They have been repeatedly made in the past when all sorts of problems in the Chinese economy have arisen, and the Chinese economy has always proved that its forward momentum is strong enough to absorb problems like that and to continue surging forwards. Above all, China retains that enormous strategic asset of massive financial reserves, not just reserves in its central bank, but the reserves arising from private savings. The Chinese people, the biggest savers in the world, lock up in their banking system. To my mind, that is more than enough to enable China to sail through all of these problems, which I think are exaggerated. So, I think that this idea that the United States can somehow wait China out, that it's somehow in a position of advantage, is simply wrong. And as we've seen, and as I've discussed in this program, this idea that the United States can somehow construct some kind of network of alliances that's going to counterbalance the growth of Chinese power, especially now that Chinese power is allied with Russian power, is completely misplaced. All this is going to do is encourage the Chinese to take the United States on in military technologies and deployments it is now almost certainly going to be able to tap into Russian technologies, and with its enormous manufacturing capabilities, it can simply outproduce anything that the United States and any collection of allies that the United States puts together can throw at it. I'm going to add, by the way, that for what it's worth, in my opinion, people also continue to underestimate Russian industrial capabilities. The Russians, with Chinese and Korean help, are busy reorganizing their shipyards, and I strongly suspect that we're going to see a major increase in Russian naval building over the next 5 or 10 years or so. But that's another story. So one way or the other, this is not a good plan. I think that it is the Chinese who are calculating that time is on their side. And if one looks things in the long term, they are probably right. But the point to also understand that the long term is a very dangerous game to play, both for the Americans and for the Chinese. Because, of course, if military deployments increase, if naval expansion takes place, if we see confrontations between the Chinese and American navies in the Pacific, if we see more Russian submarines appearing in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, if we see the balance of conventional power in Europe continue to shift in Russia's favor, as Russia has just demonstrated with the Zapad 2021 exercise, if we see more NATO attempts to try to counter this growth in Russian military power by forward deployment of NATO forces, which will leave them increasingly exposed, but also bring them into dangerously close contact with the Russians, well, there is a high likelihood that sooner or later something bad is going to happen, in which case we're going to find ourselves in a very dangerous crisis indeed. And of course, if the worst possible scenarios take place, if Ukraine does something crazy, like launch an attack on eastern Ukraine, or Taiwan decides to declare itself independent of China, then of course we will have a crisis the like of which we've never seen, either in Europe or in the Pacific, since the end of the Second World War and since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So the best thing to do is to revisit these unwise policies of pursuing a la carte discussions with the Chinese and the Russians, and to negotiate with them in earnest now. And that, as I have said, means acknowledging their red lines. Now, I want to go back to in historical time and touch on one of those negotiations that I spoke about previously. And those were those very tough negotiations the United States had with the Soviet Union in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Those negotiations proved extremely difficult for the United States, and it's well known that some people in the United States were extremely unhappy about them and felt on occasions that the Russians were gaining concessions from the United States, which the United States had been unwilling up to that point to make. But eventually, they did result in peace in Europe and stability in Europe. And there was the Helsinki Final Act, which recognized the post-Second World War borders. And of course, there was the various agreements on limiting strategic weapon systems. And at the same time, all sorts of agreements were reached to provide communications channels between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. Now, all of that happened, as I said, with the United States making very significant concessions. It had to accept, for example, the reality that at that time, we're talking about the early 1970s, the Soviet Union had a predominant position in Eastern Europe, and it had to recognize the reality of the Warsaw Pact and all of the Soviet alliance system. Well, it made that concession. It came to those agreements with the Soviet Union. The situation was stabilized in Europe. Peace was preserved. And in the long run, the United States went on to win the Cold War when the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, making the Warsaw Pact a piece of history. So it was a concession, a very difficult, very important concession that the United States made in the 1970s, but one which in the long run turned out to America's advantage. Now, I am not saying that concessions made to the Chinese and the Russians on that scale today would be as advantageous in the long term to the United States as those concessions it made in the early 1970s to the Soviets were. I think both the Chinese and the Russian political systems are far more solid than the Soviets was in the 1970s. And I would add that when the Chinese say that the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership is far more powerful than the Soviet Union in its Warsaw Pact alliance were, it's talking the literal truth. So one can't say with any confidence that concessions made today will work out to the US's advantage tomorrow in the same kind of way that concessions made to the Soviets in the early 1970s worked to America's advantage later in the 1980s and 1990s. But then, of course, you never know. It might turn out otherwise. It might turn out that China's internal problems and perhaps Russia's internal problems will indeed overtake them, and that there will be some kind of crisis in these countries, which will give the United States again an opportunity to become once more the world's unipolar superpower. I don't believe it's going to happen, but then, as I said, you never know. History can play all sorts of strange tricks, and things can turn out otherwise from what one expects. But the key point, the important and essential point, is that those agreements in the 1970s preserved peace. And they didn't just preserve peace, they did so in a way that safeguarded US core interests. And that, it seems to me, is the objective the United States needs to pursue today. It needs to recognize that China and Russia have core interests that they won't retreat from, and indeed can't retreat from. And at the same time, the United States has core interests which the Chinese and the Russians fundamentally are not interested in. That is a far more realistic way to pursue foreign policy than this game of trying to take the Chinese and the Russians on in a kind of competition, a military competition, in which the Russians and the Chinese hold all the high cards, and which will ultimately turn out badly for the US, one way or the other. Moreover, as I said, as it makes the situation in the world increasingly dangerous, that kind of competition could put us all in jeopardy, as some American generals like General Hyten of the United States is now saying. Well, I've been making this point in video after video, program after program. I appreciate that there are many people in the United States who are very resistant to this thinking. But all I will say is this: the Russians in particular have learnt the importance of sometimes trading space for time and the way that can work to their advantage. It's time that the United States learnt that same lesson. All I am asking it to do is to step back, defend its core interests, trade some space for time, sort out its internal problems, as it is fully able to do, and then perhaps re-engage from a stronger position than the one it has now. That's, it seems to me, what wise, realistic foreign policy is all about. And it's something, I'm afraid, I'm very sorry to say, that we're not getting from this administration. Thank you for joining me on this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please don't forget, by the way, to check out Alex's channel, Alex's own channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also remember to check us out on our other platforms. Above all, Locals, where we now have a thriving community and where we are increasingly publishing exclusive content. And also SuperU, which is another free speech platform that we are extremely engaged in and have very high hopes of. And of course, we're also on other platforms too, BitChute, Library, Rumble, which has some kind of connection with Locals, and also, I believe there are others too. But anyway, also, if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop, buying the amazing things that we have there, our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And also, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel and on our other channels. And please also see you on our other platforms, and have a wonderful day until then.